Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the August 6th Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. We do have quorum, and I thought I had my agenda here. Hold on. Here we go.
In the chat.
There it is. So let's just do a quick overview of the agenda. And the minutes are from our last meeting on July 30th are in the linked in the agenda. We will talk through finalizing stakeholder engagement themes, first item on the agenda. And then we are going to have a facilitated conversation by Pat Field regarding the development of vision and goals by the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee to be also incorporated into the Climate Council plan. And we'll have public comment and adjourn. So we have a kind of a pretty discussion heavy day today. So, but two main items to cover. Are there any questions related to the agenda? Okay. Actually, one thing on the agenda that it's not on there is just general updates. So I'll just start. I don't have any updates, only to say that in terms of the schedule moving forward, we have this will be our last meeting for a couple of weeks. On August 20th, we do have a meeting scheduled. So we're actually going to cancel the one on the 13th, and we have the one on the 20th. I will not be here for that one, so Catherine will be heading that up, and that'll be really devoted to the remainder of any vision and goal discussion that we need to have in finalizing that. Catherine, I don't know if you want to say anything more about the meeting on the 20th.
No, just that we still have it noted as tentative. So we hold the date and we'll have the meeting if we need to have it.
Yep. Also kind of moving forward today, our goal is to finalize the stakeholder engagement event themes. And then I anticipate we'll have some communication out about when those stakeholder engagement opportunities will occur. And definitely encourage all of our members to attend those. But if there are folks that really need to attend, we will have to call that out for you. Just depending on the area of subject matter expertise you're bringing in, and as well as the pathways that'll be discussed at those engagements. Those are the highlights. I don't know, Jane or Marion, if you want to talk about any other next steps that I might have missed.
I think you got it, Erica. I will draw your attention that on Monday there's the steering committee meeting with the co-chairs present, and so we're going to dive into the climate action plan draft and drafting, as well as milestones for subcommittees. So sort of stay tuned, and I think we'll be able to give a little sneak peek of some of those milestones as we dive into talking about your measurable goals and vision, as well as stakeholder events in the process around that.
So both Erica and I are out next Monday, correct, Erica?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if there's any member of our subcommittee who is interested in attending that steering committee meeting to represent our committee, that would be wonderful. And you could coordinate with Jane to get the details.
Yeah, that it's at 11 o'clock on Monday. And it would be really great, I think, to have a representative from Rural Resilience there if anybody's able.
Is anyone
an hour and a half?
Is anyone clamoring to be on there? Okay, I'm gonna have awkward silence for a minute.
What is it? I have my calendars. You said it's what time is it? 11 to 12:30.
Mm-hmm.
And what exactly is? I would need
So
to do.
that, you know, the steering
Where?
the steering committee is an opportunity for the steering committee is a select member of the council group that carries forward the work of the council in between meetings and service to the larger council meetings. And the meeting intended when the co-chairs come is to have substantive cross-subcommittee conversations to ensure the work is aligning and moving towards the common goal and deliverable. And so this time we're going to focus in specifically on a very detailed revised version of the climate action plan draft so that folks can see how it's going to all come together and start to have a conversation about drafting and how we get to those different components across the timeline and how the council starts to see different interim deliverables so that they're not just getting the whole package on November, I think 22nd is where it comes on the milestone, and then adopting it 2 weeks later. So trying to plan out that body of work and how we do it. And it's great for subcommittees to react to that and co-chairs specifically. And then we'll also talk about milestones for subcommittees and council meetings.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be glad to cover that for you guys.
That would be
Thank you,
great.
Joe.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, you would bring definitely bring a lot to the table on there just because of your planning background.
And the volume of task groups for which you participate or lead.
Yeah, so if you can just send me the meeting invite, that's all I think I need. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, so why don't we move into final? Oh, sorry. Are there any other updates that folks would like to share, and as well as with our liaisons to the other subcommittees?
Erica, is it worth mentioning yesterday's FEMA news?
Yeah, I can mention that. Yeah, big news. So we all fell out of our chairs yesterday afternoon because the FEMA notified everybody in the country that their hazard mitigation dollars associated with the COVID-19 major disaster declaration have been authorized. And so they've authorized about 4% of the total 15% of the total eligible costs of the disaster. And so they notified the state of Vermont that we're authorized up to $13 million to spend on hazard mitigation through the hazard mitigation unit program. That's only 4% of the total cost. Typically with public assistance disaster declarations, 15% of the total cost of the disaster comes to the state in the form of hazard mitigation funding. So if they fully authorize the full amount, we will be looking at around $45 million in hazard mitigation funding. We've got Ben's shaking his head, so I'm going to shut up. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, that's true, Erica, but we heard on a briefing this morning that this was it. There's not going to be an increase. It was done once. There's not going to be an opportunity to ask for higher obligation amounts. They took a snapshot at 4% of the currently obligated. Consequently, Vermont got rewarded richly for having been so aggressive on our project formulation on COVID-19 public assistance. Because so many of our projects have already been submitted and approved by FEMA, we got $13.4 million to spend. The other thing that's relevant to this group is that this means that money has fallen out of the sky for hazard mitigation projects for every state. That is going to magnify the chorus of voices calling for FEMA to allow ARPA funds to be used as the non-federal share match for these projects, because nobody budgeted for the non-FEMA match of so much hazard mitigation money. And so it's going to allow us to get more leverage out of every dollar that the legislature appropriated for our ARPA program. It's a tremendous multiplier for how much hazard mitigation we can do on the ground in terms of dam removals, upland floodplain buyouts, buying out people who FEMA's saying no to because they're not in the MAP floodplain. This is going to open up a lot of doors.
So it doesn't just have to be for pandemic related hazard mitigation, whatever that might look like. It could be any sort of hazard.
Yeah.
Correct. It's still under the general HMA guidance, hazard mitigation assistance guidelines.
Actually, there's a little bit of a criticism because it's under the regular hazard mitigation assistance program guidance, which doesn't really allow for mitigation projects that would mitigate the impact of a pandemic. So, for example, having a good PPE stock could be a mitigator of pandemic impacts. It's just not. It really only falls under like natural hazards. It's still so great, but it is that's one of the criticisms. It's not really an all hazard mitigation program.
Thank you.
Did you use it for the flooding last week?
Yep. I mean, it's
Well,
basically we can mitigate the flooding that happened last week.
We'll also get hazard mitigation dollars for every dollar of flood assistance we get from FEMA to repair damages from last week. We get 15 cents to make hazard mitigation grants. That's a standing feature of the FEMA disaster program. So that's in addition. So we have a lot of hazard mitigation money to spend right now.
It's a good thing. $3.46 billion nationwide. And when you look at the number of states, you can see the ones that have been aggressive in submitting their costs for COVID. And I think if people knew that, they probably would have been a lot more aggressive, but it is what it is. Okay, any other announcements? All right, let's move into the finalizing stakeholder engagement event themes. That's also linked in the agenda. There's a document linked under that agenda item.
Erica, would it be helpful if I shared my screen with that brainstorm document, or would you prefer to see it on places?
Yep. And Catherine, can I pass this over to you since you were facilitating this conversation the last meeting and I missed out on most of it?
Yes, sure, happy to. So thanks for all the great feedback last time when we had this conversation. Where we left it is that we were going to ask Marion and Pat and Jane to come back with some suggestions about how to take our feedback and consolidate this into some stakeholder and themed events to move forward and get some additional feedback and input on our pathways and strategies. And I will pleased to see that the electrical piece is moving forward. And thank you, Mike and others, for all of your work in making that part of the comprehensive energy plan update, and Anne as well, so that we can rely on that as our theme and stakeholder for the electric folks. And so it leaves us with these 4 areas: the natural lands, land use, municipal and community resilience, housing, and then the business community. And so we're going to turn it over to Marion and Jane and Pat to tell us how we might approach this and what decisions we need to make today about it.
Sure. Jane, do you want to start and just give an overview of what we talked about with David last week in terms of how these will be organized? And then we can kind of walk through where we ended last week and what we need to finalize today.
Sure. Thank you. That sounds great. So we, Marion and David Plum, who's the lead facilitator working with us from CBI, met and discussed this, but haven't circled back with Pat yet. So Pat heard this earlier today, but we haven't closed the loop exactly on whose role is what at CBI. But we did speak, as you'll all remember, the ones that are currently planned for the month of August with respect to coordinated sectoral events with the Public Service Department are being led by the Public Service Department with their support and capacity brought to bear by their facilitator. However, the ones for your subcommittee and ag ecosystems will be led through the support and capacity brought to bear by CBI. And so what we're proposing right now is that recognizing that we'd like to have the dates set, planned and implemented, and then synthesized all by the end of September, that we'd like to strive for 5 total events. That said, if you push back really hard and we need to have 6, that's possible. That recognizes that there are 2 events for ag and ecosystems already and 1 collaborative event on land use. So ag and eco would have 2 events around agriculture and food systems and forestry and the forest product sector. Land use coordinated between the 2 subcommittees, and then 2 more themes to consider for how to invite stakeholders in to discuss your proposed pathways and strategies. And I'll just say that our intent to do this is to rather quickly set up a meeting, hopefully a quick one next week with the co-chairs of Rural Resilience and Ag and Ecosystem and CBI to talk about and articulate a clear process to setting these up, recognizing that the co-chairs don't hold all the expertise in planning these, but just to articulate a straightforward process to then pull in the right task leads and appropriate folks to help coordinate that. And so I just wanted to draw your attention to that since we haven't scheduled it yet. And if Erica and Catherine, if you're both out next week, that maybe we could delegate or have another subcommittee member who is willing to help in your absence take on that planning and coordination on behalf of your subcommittee. So based on today, hopefully we can identify the themes and then move forward with respect to first and foremost setting the dates and then working backwards to put together an agenda and an invite list.
So Jane, just to be clear, so in some ways, because we have an overlap, this subcommittee would have 3, would have land use plus 2 others. And so maybe now it's for discussion about, how we kind of take the 4 listed here and think about how to, essentially 4, but we've already got, we have 3, so we just have to slot 2 things together potentially.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And Catherine and Erica, question. I mean, we made an assumption, but you and the subcommittee should correct us, that the municipal one is extraordinarily important. And so how we get particularly smaller municipalities there, and and if we end up having like some big municipalities and small ones, we may do breakouts to handle different different scales. So we can do that in a breakout structure. And then I think Catherine and we talked a little bit, and we do think the big business community through kind of mitigation stuff will probably get engaged at that, but we definitely want to make sure we get the smaller businesses that are really scattered throughout Vermont and so essential to kind of thriving local economies and small villages and towns somehow engaged in all this as well, along with obviously housing and support. So we're not trying to do that, but want your all's advice about how to kind of pull these together.
And one thing, if I can add before we kind of jump in and Pat can help facilitate this conversation. So you'll see up on the screen, and then Catherine put the link in the chat as well. I just synthesized the brainstorming that we all did at the last subcommittee meeting. So you'll see all the sort of specific notes under brainstorm notes. And then I tried to group it by the themes that were coming out that we ended with last week. And I think one important thing to think about is, as Jane noted, there's going to be a conversation hopefully next week to really nail down what we think agenda would look like and sort of scheduling the logistical details. But the intent is that these are specific sectors or groups of people that you're looking to get specific feedback on your pathways and strategies and actions that you have developed or are going to be developing from the work you've done thus far and will continue to do in August. So thinking about, we could look at your pathways if that would be helpful, and thinking about the sectors where you have specific strategies that you would like input on, and ensuring that we have a space to engage with those folks at the events that we identify. So I think, to Pat's point about the business community and sort of smaller businesses as well, and ensuring that they're engaged here. I do want to think about, which specific pathways and strategies are we looking for input from the business community on? Is it housing for employees? Is it infrastructure? Is it transportation? And what specifically has Rural Resilience identified that we would like input from the business community on? And how does that fit into the couple of events that we'll be working on? So just some context for what we're looking for today. And I think to Jane's point, we are hoping to get this nailed down today. So if we can have a conversation and come to consensus around the events, and then we'll work to identify the specific stakeholders and the specific agenda for those events starting next week.
So comments, questions, ideas, thoughts from any of the subcommittee?
On the infrastructure, I do think one of the goals of those meetings should be to get, whether it's the business community, the local government, everybody on same page, so that whatever resilience mitigation that we decide on has the public support. And what I'm talking about there is if you don't have the whole community on, then you could literally be approaching 600 different people, individual property by individual property, and it's harder to get the message out that the benefit to the whole area. I'm obviously speaking from experience here. So I think a goal of that just has to be public support, which can help everyone get on board versus all individuals. And I know that's a needle to thread because everyone has their own property, but still it can only help.
Good point.
But I do just want to remind everybody how these fit into the larger public engagement plan. And because we will be having 7 events that strive to get at that broad public support and buy-in for action with respect to adaptation, resiliency, sequestration, and mitigation strategies. And so for me, it's really thinking about where you have a suite of pathways or strategies that you can see having a significant impact and can coalesce around a theme and what that theme and message would be around bringing people in to have a specific and more technical dialogue than you would get at a more overarching public event, which will be trying to get that broad buy-in and certainly inviting in people like the business community, local and regional municipal governments and all of that. So go ahead, Joe.
Thanks. I am just wondering, sorry if we already had this discussion, but why I think infrastructure could be its own theme, because when I think about, there's transportation, there's communication, there's energy, there's water and wastewater. And so it seems like it's a really big topic. And while it certainly it's relevant to community resilience, it goes beyond just the community level. And, and I think to your last point, Jane, maybe, you could see if I don't totally understand this quite yet, but like if these are separate events, that are stakeholder events that are targeting these themes, I mean, you could see reaching out to specific stakeholder groups, for all of these types of infrastructure. So just a thought. That means it's another meeting too.
Joe, just as to blend off that or build off that, is like could we focus could the conversation be infrastructure? We really work hard to invite different kind of categories like small businesses, communities, whatever, sewage, wastewater treatment plant folks, and then we have some broad discussion. And we could even do breakouts by different parts of infrastructure or something like that. I don't know, but something like that work.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, like if that was an event on infrastructure, there could be breakout groups around each of those infrastructure types. And even where there's, I think there's definitely overlap between transportation. Well, actually there's overlap between all of those things because they share the same right of way in space. So yeah, something like that.
To that point, I will say that we've held some outreach meetings in different parts of the state, and just the electrical energy space alone, the grid took up an hour and a half, 2 hours to talk through with communities. So it might be tough to fit all of those different subjects in each meeting. But to Jane's point, there could also be follow-up meetings on individual topics, right? So maybe that's the answer.
Another question, co-chairs and others, is I know that housing is a really important topic, and so should that kind of have its own standalone? Theoretically, I guess you could treat it as infrastructure broadly described. I mean, how do we want? I know housing's super important here, and it's clearly one of the pathways that's important to you all that you name. So I wonder how you want to handle that.
I think it's just such a broad topic in and of itself, and I think it's called out specifically in the Global Warming Solutions Act that we would be we broadly as a climate council will be looking at housing, and so I think if it's not covered in some other way, I think we've got to have a stakeholder engagement around that.
As I look at, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add that since all the co-chairs presented, I have gotten some feedback that everyone likes everything we did, but I got some feedback that a lot of it was really future looking, and some people were looking for more of now. And I look at the housing a little bit like that, because where we're trying to bring development into more centralized areas, that's really what brought the feedback out. So I do think we need to think about that a little bit too, is a lot of the people we're talking to are going to be looking at that are literally living through climate change right now. What are we going to do now? So just a theme to think about.
Co-chairs, there was a member of the public who had a comment. Do you want to go ahead and let that person speak, or do you want them to put it in chat? Erica and Catherine, how do you want to do it?
Please do. Go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, we just keep it open.
Great, thanks. Dale, over to you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that, you know, resilience is threaded throughout the Global Warming Solutions Act. And of course, the Climate Council is broken into subcommittees, and this subcommittee has a focus on rural resilience and municipalities. But I'm concerned that maybe something that's missing is talk about how we build, where we build, and what we build. I'm thinking about things like the potential for a statewide building code. We have a building code, but it's has very limited applicability. Act 250 likewise has limited applicability. And I hope that as you're thinking through these events, something that would be a significant change to our state governance might be worth considering. Thank you.
And I want to check, because I think, to Dale's really good point, I'm assuming at least some of that would be covered in land use, but whether land use gets to building codes, for instance, I don't know.
And one thing I was going to note to Dale's point, and I think something to think about is I certainly think some of that would fall in the natural lands land use. If we look at both the pathways that Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience have proposed around broader land use changes, I think that would fall under the same category there. Where I'm wondering is, where is there overlap between natural lands and land use and housing? Because I think about a lot of the smart growth strategies that Rural Resilience is proposing are tied both to land use and sort of, as Dale said, how we build, where we build, and what we're building, but also to the housing piece. So thinking about, and you know, this could be a conversation for later, but if we have a separate housing event outside of natural lands and land use, where is that crossover? And how are we targeting folks separately for those meetings? And then another point just along those lines is I think about or look at the, you know, infrastructure event separate from sort of a municipal resilience capacity event. How, and this may be more just a question for Mike, are we going to be targeting the same people if we have two separate, if we have a municipal event, a sort of municipal capacity event and an infrastructure event? Like, are we going to be targeting, you know, the road foreman and the public works departments for both of those events? And if that's the case, I would think maybe it makes more sense to have it as one event, but I'm not sure. There could be obviously other people to target for different. It
probably will be the same people. My concern was more just about the length of time.
Sure.
So I agree it makes sense for one meeting, but it might be a 6-hour meeting.
I'm looking at your themes and I'm wondering about this. I wonder if you have the joint one on land use, kind of the boundaries between that and building code, I'm not sure. You have one on kind of municipal infrastructure, again, complicated that is with so many topics. And you have one on maybe just broad community resilience and housing, which covers number 1 and number 5 of your themes. The kind of infrastructure covers really 2. The possible use is going to be covered under the mitigation, cross-sector mitigation. And then the land use obviously goes into land use. So I wonder if we could, if that would work to cover your themes through 3 different meetings. Now, and that would also allow you to get some of the kind of the social questions in number 1 of your theme as well.
You lost me on those.
I don't think I like the community resilience and housing being
okay, no problem.
Combined. At least I don't like them being combined together.
So, Catherine, do you think that housing really maybe is important enough to kind of stand on its own?
Well, I I've been struggling actually with the combination with calling it a natural lands / land use session, because land use to me is the broader umbrella. And underneath that, you have the natural lands and the conservation efforts. And then you have, I like how Dale said that, how we build, what we build, where we build. And so to me, land use is the bigger umbrella. And then underneath that, you have the conservation piece and the building growth and development piece. And so if we had to take housing out and put it anywhere, I would put it in there. That's just how I think, but I don't know if everybody else would agree with me.
That could just be how I typed it, Catherine. Jane, do you have in front of you the exact wording that Ag and Eco put out? These were my quick notes.
They did put it like that, but I think in an effort to be succinct and what we're trying to accomplish, I actually very much agree with Catherine's synopsis of land use is the overarching and natural lands is a theme underneath land.
And then I'll just throw out my final thought, which is on if we pull out infrastructure and then we look at municipal and community resilience and adaptation, and going back to our charge, being asked to focus on the unique challenges of rural communities, I'm wondering if we made the municipal and community resilience and adaptation session with a focus on the challenges of rural communities.
Yeah.
Recognizing that when we come to the broader public engagement pieces, those larger municipalities that have staff will have capacity to participate in other ways, or they may choose to participate in the infrastructure piece. So those are my two thoughts listening to everybody's great ideas. Those are two things that came to mind.
So does housing go away as a separate item? It fits under land use, or is housing is more than land use, right? Housing policy is more than just land use. I take it.
I'd be curious to hear, I don't know, Bronwyn, to put you on the spot as the one ACCD rep, but thinking about the strategies that were proposed, some of them under housing, it talked about something around rehousing for homeless populations, converting, buildings in downtown centers to housing. So I think there are at least some of those that I would be interested to hear from housing advocates on sort of their reaction to those strategies. That's sort of beyond what I would think of as a land use conversation. I think it would be a separate group of people, but I guess I'm curious for Bronwyn or anybody else's opinions on that.
Tentatively speaking, for my department on this, but I agree. I see housing as really being a sub-theme of land use, but then when you really start to drill into housing, I think there's a whole nuanced level of programmatic detail that's not, necessarily tied specifically to land use. So I do think that they could be two separate conversations, sort of drilling in. And I guess to that point, I think there's a lot of potential overlap here. You can talk about infrastructure and transportation infrastructure, and that has a lot of overlap with land use and housing. So I think it's going to be tricky. There's no elegant way to just neatly tie these things up into different categories. There's going to be a lot of overlap. And I think if we can just prepare ourselves and know where there's likely to be a lot of overlapping conversation and just be ready to have some fluid boundaries around the conversation, I think that could be really helpful for these meetings.
Jane, to Catherine's question about cross-sector, are they doing anything on housing in particular?
Yeah, I was just going to respond in more detail, but yeah, they have a buildings and thermal one. So it's not really about housing policy necessarily, but some of their strategies are actually, they're going to pull those people, that constituent in, I think, for those. And I think it might be a really appropriate way to try to put the two together.
Jane, they're going to cover, I assume, more things like, insulation values or heating in buildings or whatever, right? Not necessarily the resilience of a building, say, due to a flood or whatever.
Yeah, but one of their main pathways is a clean heat standard, and it also they're talking about rental energy efficiencies, and talking about policies that get at rental properties a lot. Anyway, it does seem like they have a very big equity component of their strategies and actions that they're considering in that space, and so it feels like it might work.
That really ties on into the building code discussion too.
Yeah, exactly.
So I put up in, I'm not sure I got it quite right, but I put up in chat the potential 3 from the conversation I've heard so far, but I want to see if that looks right or it needs to be modified. It's just above Catherine's comment about cross-sector. Erica.
So our community groups piece would fall under community resilience and the challenge of rural communities.
I think so. Yeah, if I heard Catherine correctly. Bronwyn, did you have a?
Not to totally throw this on its head, but in thinking about the housing piece in particular, in thinking about the audience that you'll be attracting to these meetings, I think if you have a bunch of folks that are really doing on the ground housing work, if the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee is going to be talking about energy efficiency and thermal and all of those things, I don't know that there's going to be a huge value to having a separate conversation around housing resiliency at that same sort of building level. And so maybe there's a way to incorporate some of the housing resiliency conversation into all the energy efficiency, all the energy supply conversation that's happening in building, in housing, as opposed to keeping it separate. I mean, in theory, a lot of the mitigation strategies should also then be serving resilience benefits as well. So I think the conversation probably should be tied. And if you already have those people in a room talking about the mitigation level efforts and buildings, I think you can also have that conversation around resiliency strategies in housing. That's just a thought.
Jane, do you know how far along cross-sector is in the housing event planning and when that's scheduled for? Just wondering about the feasibility of this.
The last one, I can check on the date, but I'm sure they'll be welcome to this idea. So.
Also,
TJ
sorry,
Court.
just to throw in one more, I think there's conversations to be had around individual building resiliency, individual housing resiliency in terms of the design decisions and the retrofit decisions that are made about our building stock, particularly housing. And I think the land use piece of it has more to do with, at a community level, what are the support networks to help folks when they are displaced from their housing because of a disaster. So I think that might help split up the sort of levels of response that we might have in terms of resiliency for housing, down to the building level, design decisions to be made, and then community decisions to be made around how to support folks who are displaced from housing in disaster events.
And Ron, that just goes to my question, kind of where do building codes writ large go? So building codes, obviously not just for housing, but for, this is especially what I call resilient building codes. Should those go kind of under the cross-sector mitigation effort, or should we try to do them under land use here or somewhere else?
Keep the cross-sector.
Yeah, that's it's not a neat division, but that would be my gut, is to have that conversation along with energy code type conversations.
But are we, as part of this, so building codes seems to me like a solution to something. And are we, is that what we're doing here? Is we're saying we think you should do building codes and then we're getting reactions to that? Or is the topic housing or wherever that fits under, and we're trying to get people's thoughts and issues on, thoughts on what they think are the issues and concerns and what some strategies are to address that? Because it just seems like if you're sort of saying right up front, this is what we're going to talk about, we're sort of saying then that's whatever. It could be building codes, it could be take your pick. So I'm just wondering how that all fits into what we're doing right now.
If you could, Joe, to that point, if you could maybe just say, like, if buildings are going to, cross-sector mitigation is going to focus at the building level, including housing, whatever tools you choose to use. But on the community scale, the land use scale, this is where our land use meeting would be about for land use, conservation, growth and development, planning and zoning, those kind of broader scale things. What would that work as a separation?
So the meeting is about zoning and maybe building codes and maybe other things that could help improve resilience.
Right. It could be. I think, again, whether if you wanted buildings writ large to go under cross-sector mitigation, they'd have to address the resilience part of buildings through whatever means they want to, right? And then here in the land use, we focus just at the broader scale, like land use as you traditionally think of it, zoning and planning, right? Which doesn't get down to building level design.
Okay.
It's really up to all of you. And if maybe just because of time, co-chairs, I don't know if you have any final thoughts on this or committee, and maybe we're getting close, but we're not quite there, whether we should leave this to final machinations after today, or you want to try to pin this to the wall, so to speak. Co-chairs, what do you think?
I think we need to pin this to the wall. We need to reach finalization on this because I don't think we're going to be coming back for further discussion. I was just double checking our pathways to make sure that they neatly fall within the sessions.
So with what you've heard today, Pat and Jane and Marion, and what we've talked about and the direction that you've gotten, combined with what you know about what's happening in all of the other areas, do you have enough to design something that will address these comments and fit these things in? Or do we need more discussion today?
Jane, Jen, you've been across all these conversations about this, so what do you think?
I feel comfortable that that we can fit housing in with cross-sector, and land use. I feel comfortable that we can push back on ag and eco and entitled event land use. And so if everybody is supportive of that in this subcommittee, I think it would just be a matter of refining it and making sure you're comfortable with the two other focuses here. Yeah, those two right there, and make sure that feels comprehensive enough. And I suspect, based on your pathways and strategies, those will get at the largest number of issues that you're likely to run up against. And I really like the emphasis for the municipal or community resilience with an emphasis on rural communities.
And just quickly, I want to make sure that we're not missing, I think there was an important point last week about including the business community and private sector. Do we want to try to slot them into these existing events? Yes. Okay. So then that will come through. I'm seeing Erica nodding, which is why I said yes. So that will then come through identification of stakeholders, but I think would rely on folks that have, connections with those businesses that you all think would be good to engage in these specific topics.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
Leads, I think.
Yep.
And also there is the development conference in the fall that I think we identified as a potential route for some direct outreach that hopefully the council as a whole can work with as a method of some direct outreach.
Yeah, you're talking about the Whitenberg Associates Conference?
Correct.
Yeah, that one's in November, so it would be a little tight to get feedback, but I think we could, certainly engagement will continue beyond the sort of September timeframe, but I think Jane will talk about this a bit more, but we're looking to get feedback from these events quickly back to the subcommittee so that you all can incorporate it into your sort of final iterations of your strategies and actions before you present those to the Climate Council.
And maybe one last comment is, I think the easy part of designing a good meeting that people show up, that when people are there, and you all have done great work and the co-chairs will help shape and inform that. The hard part is actually getting people to show up. So that's going to be where we're really going to need all of your networks and your influences to get people to come. And that's actually the hardest work. So just want to put people on notice about that. Okay, so I think
And with that in mind, I'll just note that the municipal and community one should be in the evening.
There was I don't know if Jane made the comment or Marion, to identify some subcommittee member that could work. I can't remember which one we were talking about for the planning on.
Probably for all, maybe for all
Next-
three.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just for overall planning process right now, not for a specific stakeholder event quite yet.
Okay. How about when we nail these down, we can identify subcommittee members that can help with the planning for them based on the pathways that they developed, because these actually our pathways fit pretty neatly into these. So the folks that develop them should be able to provide that input.
I think that would be very helpful. And then I think Jane and Marion, to the point that we're going to move housing kind of over to cross sector, maybe we need somebody from this subcommittee to make sure they sit on the planning for that portion of the cross sector mitigation. So,
Bronwyn, would you be able to help with that?
Sure.
Thank you.
awesome.
I'll send an email right now, Bronwyn, to those leads, telling them to reach out to you. So.
Right.
And then should we identify somebody that can help with land use in the development of the ag and ecosystems, or should we rely on Marion and Jane?
If we get one now, let's do it. Is there somebody who can help us with the land use one? Who has particular interest and focus on that?
Well, Jens isn't here, but I feel like Jens or Chris Cochran as one of those people would be great with whoever else.
I think
Hesitant
Bronwyn- yeah.
I'm hesitant to volunteer Chris, but I mean, I am here speaking for him. So, and if he can't, then I can fill in as well on behalf.
Thank you. I think that would be great. And then I'll be back to work on Friday, and the week after Erica's out for 2 weeks. So we'll be able to coordinate, but just to not hold up the whole process, it'd be great if you can jump in.
And it seems like, you know, Catherine, if you're, I mean, you'll help on all three, but I think particularly the community resilience and rural communities would be really, really good to have your expertise in. And Eric, obviously, for community infrastructure, in particular, bring you back for sure. So.
And we won't let Mike off the hook because it was his idea to pull out infrastructure.
Okay, Mike, you're on that. You've just been voluntold.
It was a good idea too. Thank you for that suggestion.
All right, good.
Can I just one question for the planning meeting next week, unless it's Friday, which we can include Catherine too, but we'll just look for Bronwyn to provide support at a high level for next week, and then recognize that we'll pull in others as needed going forward.
Right.
Yeah, and I would love it if Anne, you're able to provide some feedback on the community one as well. I think your experience in community resilience organization, having an impacted property and being part of a small local government will help us really build a good session there.
All right, that's great. All right, anything else on this one? Okay. Co-chairs, we're ready to go to the next topic?
I think we are.
Okay.
Handing it back to you, Pat.
Okay, good. So Marion's going to give a little bit of an overview of why we're thinking about these like big goals for a second. And then I think we're going to do a little bit of brainstorming by your themes or your pathways about maybe some potential goals within each. And then when we come back, you know, in a little bit, we'll have that summarized for you and we can decide whether we can roll that up into something even bigger or not. But we thought we'd brainstorm kind of at the pathway level today. But first, Marion has some slides to kind of set the stage.
Okay. So, so to set the stage, what we're going to be talking about today is really a focus on how do we as a subcommittee and more broadly a climate council develop measurable goals for sequestration, adaptation, and resilience actions and strategies and pathways that supplements and complements those reduction requirements for mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions that are already identified in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I'm going to walk through just a couple of slides here, and then we'll start our conversation. I want to preface this by saying today isn't the only day we have to talk about this, and I think there's a potential for it to feel a bit overwhelming, which is okay. We'll get some thoughts down and then start to think about how we work these out to get to these measurable goals that we're looking for inclusion in the climate action plan. So we'll get started through this, and then just to say, I only have one screen, so it's hard to see folks. So if you have something to add or want to just jump in and unmute, that's perfectly fine. All right. So we'll start off by just reminding folks that, as I said just a minute ago, there are greenhouse gas reduction requirements already outlined in the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think most folks are familiar with those. It's that 26% below 2005 levels by 2025, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And those are requirements, which is what obviously cross-sector is working very closely on developing those pathways, strategies, and actions to meet those reduction requirements. In addition to that, the Global Warming Solutions Act also identifies a target of being net zero or having net zero emissions across all sectors by 2050. And this speaks more to a sequestration element of the Global Warming Solutions Act, but did want to highlight this because it's sort of the lesser known requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act. But this is really what's laid out in the Act. And beyond that, there are certainly requirements to look at resilience and adaptation elements, but there aren't these sort of measurable goals or targets identified in the Act to really guide the work that you all are doing. Given that, what we're looking to work with subcommittees on is developing sequestration, adaptation, and resilience goals that are, if possible, tied to that 2025, 2030, and 2050 timeframe that you note exists for the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. This is the same presentation I used for the Ag and Ecosystems meeting this morning, which is why sequestration is in here as well. But I think for rural resilience, you all are really focused on those adaptation and resilience elements. So by developing these goals, it really helps us meet three objectives for the climate action plan. One is to, as I said a bit earlier, to inform and strengthen the role of those adaptation, resilience, and sequestration elements in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and to sort of elevate them in addition to those mitigation requirements that have been outlined. Number two is to give us benchmarks by which to measure our actions. So when we come to implementation of the climate action plan, as this is a process that repeats every 4 years, that we start to have benchmarks by which to measure our progress outside of what's already identified for mitigation. And then lastly, it's to set the scale and sort of the kind of action that's needed to achieve goals. So by identifying goals and for lack of a better word, sort of thinking about our wish list for what we might want to work to achieve, I think it will help us as a group and the Climate Council at large identify where there might be actions that we need to focus on in the near term and the long term for the climate action plan and for really getting Vermont to all of our goals within the Global Warming Solutions Act. And then the last thing I'll just note is, there is certainly an opportunity as we think about developing measurable goals across all of these elements to think that in the future they could be adopted by the legislature and become written portions of the Global Warming Solutions Act to complement those mitigation reduction requirements. So again, there's nothing in the Global Warming Solutions Act beyond that. The mitigation requirements and that one sequestration net zero emissions target. But there's certainly an opportunity for the Climate Council to recommend that goals be adopted in future iterations of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which would provide a little more meat behind some of the actions that we'll be using to meet them. So what we're looking to just start the conversation with today, again, you don't need to feel too tied down to finishing this conversation today. We're going to kind of think about how we work on this moving forward. And this is our proposal, and I think we're certainly willing to have feedback from you all on whether this does or doesn't make sense for the work that you all have done thus far. And if you want more or less goals, we can certainly think about that. But goals in general should be broad, which isn't a very helpful identifier. again, potentially identified to 2025, 2030, or that 2050 timeframe, and addresses multiple pathways. Ideally, what we're looking for, and again, we can noodle with this a bit, but looking for one set of goals for sequestration, one set for adaptation and resilience in natural and working lands, and then one set for adaptation and resilience in municipalities in the built environment. And when I say a set, I mean one goal each tied to that 2030, 2050, 2025, 2030, and 2050 timeframes that are identified in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I'm going to show two examples from other climate action plans that I've been reviewing to kind of get a sense for what exists out there in terms of adaptation and resilience goals. I will say there's not a whole lot out there, I think primarily because adaptation and resilience has always been viewed at a very local level, and as being actions at a local level, that it can be difficult to develop broader regional or state level goals for that, but we're going to give it a shot. And there are a couple of places where adaptation and resilience and sequestration goals have been identified. So I'm going to show two examples that are quite different that I think will help spur some conversation today about how we get to goals and sort of at what level we develop them. So the first example comes from Chicago's Climate Action Plan, which was just released a month or so ago. They have in their entire plan two very broad goals, and then under the goals, they have what they call interim targets. And those interim targets are tied to their timeframes, so 2030, 2040, and 2050. And you'll see for the adaptation ones that are up there identified in green, they're very broad. 2030 for them is really addressing governance that is climate resilient. 2040 is resilience across jurisdictions, and 2050 are cohesive, resilient communities. And in reviewing Chicago's plan, the sense that I'm getting is if you look at sort of the descriptive paragraphs below the green text for the interim targets, what they're looking at for 2030 and sort of their nearest time frame are, how do we address regulations and permitting across jurisdictions at the sort of local jurisdiction level for climate resilience governance. 2040 is broadening a bit to think about the regional scale and how do we work across municipal boundaries for resilience. And then 2050 is when they're starting to pull in infrastructure, community groups, all of those other sort of, informal or volunteer networks. And that's what they're shooting for 2050. So in my mind, I think, maybe they were thinking 2030 is sort of the more concrete regulations that we have currently that we can look to adapt. And then moving beyond that is looking at a regional level and then looking more at the infrastructure and community network scale. And all of their interim targets and then their really broad goals are tied to both mitigation and adaptation strategies, but they don't have mitigation targets or goals identified in their plan. They sort of group that in with adaptation. So that's Chicago. And then I'll show you another example from Los Angeles County, where they have a much more specific set of targets that are tied to their sort of 17 overarching strategies that cut across the majority of the sort of sectors that they're focusing on for their plan. So you'll again see that these are tied also to their timeframe, so 2025, 2035, and 2045. But what they've done here is actually tie specific numbers to two sets of goals. One is restoration of acres of forest land, and the other is an increased percentage of urban tree canopy cover. The other interesting thing I wanted to note with LA County's plan is they've also tied all of their targets to greenhouse gas mitigation potential. In this case, it's really, you'll see in the bottom, focused on their sequestration potential. But this is really tying it back to their mitigation targets that they have identified in their act as well. So this is a different approach to targets where it's much more focused on, tying a specific number or specific percentage to those timeframes, whereas what you saw for Chicago was much broader, really just focused on more at the governance level in terms of sort of policies that they would want to look to adapt. So at this point, I think we could probably pause for some questions and reactions, and then I'll hand it over to Jane, who's just going to close up with some summary on how this fits into the climate action plan, and then just talking a bit about milestones as well. Oops, I see there's some comments in the chat.
Bronwyn's got a good point. One's kind of a process goal and one's an outcome goal.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
And we can think about both in our cases as we walk through this, depending on what you all are.
Yeah. And again, I think we're really looking for feedback from you all. I think generally that, having these goals in the climate action plan will help us both short-term and long-term in terms of prioritization and then implementation after the plan is finished. But I think would welcome feedback on whether we think a sort of process-oriented goal setting or outcome-oriented goal setting makes more sense for this group.
I think you need one to get the other. I think you need them both.
Sure.
Okay, that's a nice point.
Yeah.
Yeah, my gut reaction is that I can see value in doing both. I think, and again, being new to Vermont and seeing how things work here, it seems like a good process goal is that the state is able to help provide the support to towns and cities to do these vulnerability assessments and start implementing some of the actions. And then you can tie to that an outcome goal, which is, how many towns or cities have done a vulnerability assessment. So I think they're very much, it would be good to start thinking now about what are the processes the state needs to put in place, but what would the ideal outcome of those processes be?
Yeah, great point, Bronwyn. And I think the other thing, I keep forgetting to say this when I talk about this, but as we talk about goals, I think immediately many of us jump to start thinking about metrics and how are we going to measure these goals. I think, one of the interesting ways I think that we could start to approach this is thinking about the metrics that we already track at a state or a local level in terms of, we know number of municipalities that have adopted local hazard mitigation plans. And I mean, certain things that we track for ERAF, and there are other metrics that the state likely tracks. And how does that feed into a larger outcome goal that's really tracking the progress to get there? But I like your point, Bronwyn, of sort of needing also both of those outcome and process targets as they speak to each other.
Jane.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on I think that it would be easy to get very hung up on how we track this and how we set metrics. And so I just wanted to say that while I think they are important to set a goal that is attainable and measurable, I think that we want to stay at a higher level for the sake of this exercise. And then I also wanted to suggest that just let you know that we have CADMIS on contract that is focused on measuring and assessment of specifically mitigation strategies and how we're going to track that over time in our progress to emissions reductions. They're also thinking in some component around sequestration because we're doing the carbon budget and we're anticipating doing some sequestration forecasting. So similar to the mitigation modeling that we're doing, we'll have a business as usual model with respect to how much we'll sequester carbon based on policies currently in place and then some tracking and levers that we pull around sequestration. I think that based on my understanding of the budget and what we expect to receive with respect to further support for technical analysis with respect to the climate action plan, I really think that we'll be able to, as you set these goals, think about what the tools are that you need through the capacity of a contractor to help you support how we measure and track progress towards your goals. And so it's not necessarily only the metrics that we currently have, but what else could we be tracking in the future and how could a contractor help us? And that is the way that you could also be thinking about how these goals help you further refine and identify new strategies and actions that get at measuring and tracking progress over time.
Joe, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how the pathways, which I think really are goals. I mean, we just use the word pathway. And I'm just wondering how is that what, should those be the framework for the measures? So we're really talking about finding measures towards something, towards goal, I guess towards resilience, right? Adaptation and resilience. And it seems like the pathways should be guiding our selection of what those measures are. Am I right about that? Or if I'm not, what's the relationship of the pathways to it?
So here's, Joe, that's a good question. So here was our thought, is we think easy is not the right word, but the slightly less hard approach to do is take the pathways and think about the goals for each. If this group can see an overarching goal that cuts across pathways, that would be great because for like state legislature to have like one goal for community resilience would be fabulous, like one goal for mitigation. That may be impossible, we don't know, but we thought start with the pathways and goals, see how we do. If we can roll them up to something above that, we will. If we can't, we can't. So that was our thought.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. And I think for resilience and adaptation for both you and the ag and ecosystems, this is a little more complicated project to undertake because it can be hard to think about what metrics we're trying to use, all those kinds of things. Why don't we, I think, Jane, why don't you go to that one other slide about kind of how it fits into the report, quote unquote, and then let's actually stop there and maybe do a little bit of brainstorming to start. We obviously won't finish the conversation today.
Yeah, so I'll advance for you, Jane. Actually, I did want to just reply to Joe's point because we've been wrestling with that a lot too. One way I think of it is thinking of the mitigation reduction requirements. So there's just that one set for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And for cross-sector, they have multiple pathways that are broken down more specifically by their sectors. So transportation, buildings and thermal, non-energy. And so those are all feeding up to their one mitigation requirement, which is obviously a little bit different than the exercise you all have to undertake, but that's how I've been thinking about the pathways feeding into a broader goal, is the pathways are one, kind of a slightly subcomponent of that goal. And the goal is how are we going to sort of measure how we're getting there in progress. So, but I'll turn over to Jane to talk about the rest.
Yes, and it's not dissimilar from sequestration, right? Because we can do this a very similar set high level goal that's measurable for sequestration in that right now we have net zero by 2050 across all sectors. But we imagine that we might want to do something stronger, recognizing that if we hit our emissions reductions by 2030, we'll be net zero across all sectors by 2030 because of the sequestration potential already in the state. And so they could set a goal that's something like, no net loss of sequestration by 2025, a net increase in sequestration by X% by 2030, and to be net negative by 2050 by X%. So again, that would impact, conservation, forests, ag lands, everything that has sequestration potential. I will identify that I think adaptation and resilience is the hardest of all of them to come up with an easy, like one sentence phrased measurable goal. But the intent of this exercise is as we were building out and clarifying the specificity in the climate action plan outline, we were trying to think about how we articulate a comprehensive narrative for the body of work underneath the areas that you'll be working towards with respect to your pathways. For rural resilience as well as ag and ecosystems. And so the body of the climate action plan, and we're going to discuss this in much more detail on Monday with the steering committee, really has three main components. The foundational work, which is underneath the introduction and the law that governs it. And then the body, which is really where the meat of all of the work at the subcommittee level will go, which is by pathways. And those pathways will be bucketed by sectoral contributions, whether it's transportation or whether it's community resilience or infrastructure. We have a number of headings, and actually I think we really want to dive in on Monday and further with your subcommittee about how we bucket the adaptation and resiliency pathways in the climate action plan. But our intent here is underneath where we originally had a section that was just speaking to emissions reductions. There's recognition that there are clear requirements in the GWSA that lay out a body of work that the climate action plan will cover. And while there's only specific measurable goals associated with emission reductions, the requirements speak very clearly to what will be included in the climate action plan around adaptation, resiliency, sequestration, smart growth. So we were trying, as we're thinking about this, to think about how we tell a compelling narrative that pulls together your work up in this section at the beginning that could be adopted by the council and further push and refine strategies and actions that could at some point further refine the GWSA itself to adopt a specific measurable target within the body of the law that we could be working towards. And that will hopefully also help you elevate as you have to move through and prioritize which actions are ready for implementation and which actions require additional development. Really what you're thinking to is that how those actions help you reach your goal and bring specificity to the work. That'll also tie down to how we measure and assess progress. And as I suggested earlier, we're developing that tool right now for mitigation but that hopefully will highlight how we can do a better job tracking this work going forward in the space of resiliency and adaptation, and call to question ideas for how to track that. So I really am excited about the idea of elevating this work and trying to speak to it at the same level, and recognizing that climate policy really needs to have the three-legged stool of mitigation, resilience and adaptation, and sequestration. So hoping that this exercise is able to elevate that. So I'll pause here. We have a next step slide that talks more about milestones and how this work is all going to fit in, but I'll let you, Pat, facilitate the conversation from here.
Why don't we do, we'll cover that maybe slide towards the end. Why don't we, Marion, do you want to go to the, I think we have a kind of a, we thought we'd do a little bit of work. So, and we're going to kind of organize it, to Joe's point, by pathway, at least to start. So what we thought we would do is just start with pathway 1, and Marion will pull that up. And then what we'll do is again, the idea is initially we just want to brainstorm with you all what might be potential goals for this pathway. We'll jot the notes down. We'll get as far as we can today. And then we'll have we may find some way to kind of pull you or ask you to fill out a matrix or something after today to help kind of fill this in further, so that we can be more focused, even more focused next meeting. So to start with 1, what we'd love to do is just brainstorm your ideas. Let's not spend too much time judging them yet, but like building off each other, like what might be a specific goal for pathway 1, and it's up there listed. Eric, over to you.
I'm a little confused. I was tracking a goal or a goal set that evolves over 2025, 20, I can't remember the years.
30 and 20.
But I wasn't tracking that they were separate goal sets for each pathway. I was kind of tracking that and so I'm totally backwards, I see. I was tracking that we were looking for a goal set that really spoke to the pathways broadly, and really the pathways are the how that we're going to reach that goal. Am I wrong? Am I backwards?
No,
you're right.
You are
totally
right. And the challenge is, can we do that? So I think we've had a little pushback from other subcommittees that it's too hard to start at that high level. So some folks wanted to start at the mid level. So that's why we thought we'd start at the pathway level. But if you guys want to think about the big goal for the whole subcommittee, kind of rural resilience, have at it. When folks look at these pathways, and what are they all working towards? So when you picture Vermont in 2050, and you picture resilient Vermont communities in 2050, what do they look like? They have significantly reduced their exposure to hazards that are exacerbated by climate change. They have strong community networks and financial assistance for folks that are impacted by disasters. They have access to support post-disaster. They are not located in areas of town where they have exposure to disaster, like flooding. So I'm just kind of like spitballing, but like when you think about what you'd like to see in Vermont communities in 2050, and how these pathways support the accomplishment of that, what does that look like, and can we coalesce that into a goal for Vermont adaptive and resilient communities? What do folks think? Building on Erica's really nice start, what do people think? I really like, Erica, your frame. Like, what does it look like in 2050? That's a really nice way to frame it. Like, what do you got that says you really, you're powerfully resilient and adaptive?
This is fresh in my mind because last week we had a flooding event in southern Vermont, and the challenges that we're facing are people are trying to replace heating systems and electrical systems in their homes. They are trying to restore access to their homes. They're trying to gain access to financial support to get back on their feet and get back to their jobs. These are challenges that occur every single time a disaster happens. And we have an opportunity to make recommendations that would take those challenges off their plate. because they would have easy access to those things, because these disasters are going to continue to happen. But our task here is recommendations on how we can make them more resilient and bounce back more quickly from them.
That's right. Additional thoughts to what Mary is going to try to capture what Erica said. So just jump right in. We're just brainstorming for now. So what do you all think?
Yeah, just to build off what Erica says a little bit. I mean, I think everything that you listed, Erica, could have a measure associated with it and a specific goal associated with it. But when I think of resilience overall, I think, you know, it's basically in the face of all the changes that are coming because of climate change, you know, Vermonters continue to, you know, enjoy, they can undisrupted, good quality of life and, you know, everything that goes along with it. That's a really hard thing to measure, but I think, you know, the vision is something like that. It's like our lives will continue and will thrive even in the face of all of these threats from climate change. And so I don't know really how to put a number on that, but I think everything that Erica sort of listed sort of supports achieving that vision, I guess.
Just to jump on that, Joe, I think you all don't have to put a number on it. I would thinking back of the Chicago example, they have it certainly tied to a time frame, but it's not, you know, a percentage or a number of acres conserved or anything like that. And if that's the route you all want to go, I think that's great.
I know Ben's got his hand up. I want to go to a comment Jamie, but Ben, over to you.
Thank you. Hello. I've seen some dashboards that I really like that look not at numbers, but at rates of change or rates of things. So, for example, in mitigation or climate adaptation, if you will, you know, we always come back to the saying, when you're in a hole, stop digging. And you know, anything we measure, how many buyouts a year, you know, we can come up with all these metrics, and they're artificially bound by factors we don't control and by the arbitrariness of the time frame, and they don't really necessarily get to the nub of what we're trying to do. What I think we do fully control is the rate at which we continue to make ourselves more flood vulnerable. So, for example, in 2030, what percentage of the new homes that are built will be built in flood-prone locations? And how about in 2040? Hopefully it'll be zero. As we look at the flood damages from the most recent flood, the vast majority of the damages that people are reporting are for private roads and driveways. What percentage of the housing stock that gets built year to year to year is going to require how many additional linear feet of private road and driveway? The less linear feet of private road and driveway that we build in order to provide the additional units of housing that are required from year to year, the more resilient our housing stock will be to future floods. So I think we can take a snapshot in time and say, from this point forward, we're going to measure how much we're doing it right. Sorry, that got a little convoluted, but I
No,
there's something there.
No, that's helpful. That's very helpful. And those might be, again, those things might be, you know, to Erica's kind of qualitative really vision in 2050, then some of the things you've described can then track to get there step by step.
Right. And if I can just throw one more sentence in there, something that we've been thinking about as we deal with the dozens of folks who did get clobbered last Thursday night. Our solution of last resort for people who get damaged by flooding is the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund, which is a private philanthropy, and they're struggling with how broadly to open their fund for people who have, for example, private driveway damages. And we were talking about perhaps there needs to be a line in the sand drawn to say to people, if you purchased or live in or inherited a home that is on a long private driveway, as of today's date, okay, we have sympathy and we'll try to help on a neighbor basis. But after a certain date, maybe it's 2 years from today, if you build a home that has a private road or driveway, be on notice that the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund is not there as a safety net, and you are on your own going forward. In other words, the
And
state
Ben, that's helpful, but I think it's a little lower down.
Yeah,
That's
it's in the weeds, but it's an example of how we can, if we set a target of less linear road feet per housing unit, we have many tools at our disposal to incentivize that behavior.
Really good point. Nice connection between the two. Sorry to interrupt there. Jay, you had a point about, you wanted to say more about trying to visualize a 2050 community, and you may be getting at compact growth. I'm not sure, but Jay, I want to turn it to you first.
Yeah, thanks. I think, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and this is all very complicated, but the easier you can make it for people to see what the future looks like, the easier it is to act. And I guess that's the point I want to make in investing perhaps in some artistic licensing of downtown communities that we also want to build generally, not just for climate resilience, but it just seems like a nice way to tell a story and a good way to hang our hat on things. And then the other point I made earlier was about targets. And I know we're trying to hit very clear statutory targets, but certain targets and those numbers and being very consistent and clear, net zero by 2050 is just powerful to say that. So I just want to make sure we come back to that and for engaging a lot of people, that we tell that story really strongly from the top.
Jay, it's interesting to think about a graphic or something, to your point of like it shows, I don't know, a compact village, to Ben's point, short driveways, no infrastructure in floodplains. I don't know what else you'd describe, but that's an interesting thing for us all to be thinking about, is the visualization of that is really interesting. Bronwyn, you were next, then Erica.
I wrote my comment in the chat. I'll just quickly summarize that. I liked Erica's framing at the high level, and I think it lends itself towards some more specific 2025, 2030 targets. And so I just threw out some examples. For example, a 2025 target or a goal, sorry, a 2025 goal could be to just increase the number of municipalities that have done vulnerability assessments. So we're starting to build the information about what is vulnerable, what actions need to be taken to improve the resiliency in communities. And then a 2030 goal building on that could be to reduce the amount of infrastructure or the amount of new building that's going into high risk hazard areas. And so those are very sort of concrete, specific things that would get to Erica's overarching goal of eliminating the hazard and reducing the downtime after a climate event.
No, nice, thank you. And if you think of something for 2050, chat it in. That's really great. Erica, over to you, then to Joe.
Just building on what Joe said, which is, I think frames it nicely in terms of reducing or eliminating disruption in our lives and being able to thrive in in the face of climate change that are climate change exacerbated disasters. And if we think about 2050, I have a few more items that we're looking at undisruptible, very strong communication systems, so we don't have communications interruptions. We're looking at power infrastructure that is extremely resilient and either does not fail or the restoration time is very short. We're looking at water and wastewater systems that are not breaking in the middle of winter because of our variable temperature, swings in temperature throughout the winter. I mean, these are the things that I am thinking about in terms of like where we're at in 2050. I mean, you can kind of go down through the pathways and look at what we have set in our pathways, and you could say, well, what do we want our, what do we want to see in terms of municipal school district and residential fossil fuel use in 2050? What do we want to see in terms of our land use policies in 2050 that in terms of where they're at versus getting there? Where do we want folks to be housed and have confidence in their housing so that they're not going to lose their housing. And if they're having to be rehoused, they're housed in safe safe places. Those are the things that, we like when we're framing out the picture of where we want to go, because we've done such a great job with our pathways. The pathways are to the goal of a fully resilient Vermont.
That's nice. Really, all really good stuff here. Joe and then Mike.
Well, I'm just thinking about this may be down in the weeds a little bit again, sorry, but I'm thinking about the municipal vulnerability index that we're supposed to be developing. And I'm wondering if, I see that as like working off the work that Mike did, for example, and then building in a lot of the other factors, again, kind of what Erica just kind of rattled off. And that becomes the index, and that might be something that we can use as to say, improve the vulnerability index by X, which I think, and I know you said, or maybe others have said, it's not really resilience, but if you reduce vulnerabilities, you are improving resilience. And that might be something we can hang our hat on if we feel that we're looking for an outcome sort of related goal as opposed to a process related goal. So I just wanted to plug, let's not forget about that potential tool that we might have.
And Joe, that's nice only because it's somewhat comparable, like reduce GHG emissions by X, right? This is another way to say then, improve or reduce vulnerability index by Y. Then you're kind of giving a similar method and focus on community resilience, though I'm sure we can discuss the details. But Mike Burke and then Ben, I think if Ben has a comment. Mike?
Yeah, Erica hit a lot of the things I was thinking about. And again, the part that I see interesting there is there's almost two things. There's one, what can we do in the future that we've learned from in the past? So Ben's point about shorter linear feet of driveway, it's the same thing in the power world. If somebody builds to one house, a 2-mile long overhead line, it's pretty hard to take care of for the next 50 years. So we're looking at how we do that different. But my point is, we're going to get better in the future with how we build, how we design, but most of the existing things that are out there for what people see as Vermont, the rolling hills and the farms that are way out in the middle of nowhere, aren't going away either. So I do think we have to continue to concentrate on becoming more resilient in those areas as well. And what Erica mentioned helps measure that. Like even replaced all the undersized culverts. I know that's way down in the weeds, but that's how we're going to wake up in the morning. When Erica first started this conversation, I actually felt like I was sitting at my house in a storm and waiting for it to go by. And when I walked out in the morning, everything was okay. And that's not always how it is right now. So thank you.
Nope. Mike, thanks. Joe, did you have another comment or are you all set?
I'm all set. Thank you.
Good. And Ben, did you have another one or are you all set?
All set, thanks.
Okay. All right, this is really great. Addition, I think one thought we'd have is let's continue this brainstorming, and then maybe what we do, we can talk about what to do from here after we think just a little bit more through this. So other things that people want to name here, just to make sure we capture and how we fold them into kind of a potentially a qualitative and then maybe a quantitative approach. Anything else you want to add in terms of key points or issues? And we've got some nice stuff in chat we'll pull into.
Patrick, this has been actually, there is one other possible metric is to look at the amount of precipitation that we can handle without having a disaster. We've had storms since Irene that were much less impactful to community infrastructure because the things that we rebuilt after they were destroyed by Irene were rebuilt in a more resilient way. And so if we think that 5-inch per hour storms are going to be a normal thing by 2050, our goal could be to withstand a 5-inch per hour storm within our infrastructure or in our new infrastructure. So our standards could be in sync with how much worse we think the weather's going to get. That's another way of thinking about goals.
Interesting. Like, something been like, this is probably too, not quite right, but like no thing and no one is displaced by a storm that is bad as X.
Right.
That's great. It's really nice.
Yeah.
And maybe there's an equivalent to, in so much as heat becomes an issue sometimes. I don't know whether there's an equivalent to heat or not, but.
Absolutely, yes. There's a lot of work on heat islands that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, Pat, if I can jump in, I couldn't find my raise hand when I'm sharing my screen, but I appreciate Ben's sort of all the ways to track using, flooding and rain as kind of the primary, because that is the biggest hazard in Vermont. But I think it was a 7 Days article this week that came out about Burlington and Burlington's heat index as a heat island. And it contrasted a really interesting point that, 10, 15, 20 years ago, Burlington was really trying to focus development in their downtown areas because they're trying to avoid sprawl, which is something that we're talking about a lot in this subcommittee. But because of that, they increased use of asphalt and concrete in a lot of their areas to incentivize, business growth and housing growth in their sort of downtown area. And due to that, they have an incredibly high heat index, something like 7 degrees above normal, and it's really high. And so I think too about just ensuring that we're thinking about all of our hazards, but also thinking about something that I think I keep going back to in the charge of rural resilience and adaptation in the Global Warming Solutions Act is not only, how are Vermont communities more resilient to disasters, but how are we also ensuring communities are equipped and have the capacity to adapt to the types of programs and policies that the climate action plan may promote, like smart growth, that may then have a consequence of actually increasing the heat index for urban areas. So I think just something to keep in mind as we think about both ways to track, but then sort of the broader goals that we're looking to set for resilience and adaptation.
Anne's put some interesting potential metrics in that list as well. And I have one question for you all. So your pathway 3 is that support reduction of municipal, school district, and residential fossil fuel use. So Jane, is that something that the cross-sector mitigation will generally cover under GHG reduction emission reductions? Or is that something this group needs to think more about in terms of just fossil fuel use reduction?
Yeah, it is a necessary next step, and one that that's one of many areas that needs to be coordinated across subcommittees. And we've been looking towards Monday's steering committee meeting to provide a bit more guidance on how we'll move forward with those kind of cross-cutting issues. But there's a real need to get cross-sector mitigation strategies to this subcommittee to put that particular emphasis and focus on rural communities, and then specifically on fossil fuel use in rural buildings.
Okay, so we may have to come back to that if we do a little bit more work. Erica.
Kind of along those lines, and Marianne, thank you for pointing that out, because we talk a lot about flooding, but we don't, because it's the number one thing. But when we talk about rural resilience on a statewide level, because we are a rural state, we also have to think about this in terms of our resilience towards our ability to provide some of the basic needs for people in a catastrophic disaster and very quickly to avoid interruption. And those things are food, water, shelter. And so resilience to supply chain interruptions that are inevitably going to occur. And I don't know how to do this, but it's basically, making sure that there are not supply chain interruptions, or we are able.
What, did Erica just freeze?
I think so. I wasn't sure if it was me or Erica. Erica, we just lost you.
To take care of, this speaks to folks that are dependent on have functional needs or dependent on medical equipment, not having to worry about interruptions to or access to that medical equipment or medications. So it's stuff that's on a broad scale and not just at a municipality level is really what I'm talking about.
I'm not sure this quite works, but it's like almost like all in 2050, all Vermonters have access to food, water, and shelter, regardless of the severity or extent of the disaster or something like that. Because you've captured, I think, nicely those three. So
Can I just note too, I love this brainstorm, and I think the ideas that we're throwing out for 2025, 2030, 50. I think I am thinking even just in terms of like a resilience to supply chain interruptions, some of this may be better suited as a strategy or an action. So what are the steps, that we're taking to ensure we have supply chain resilience, and that gets to sort of a larger goal. But that's the entire point of part of this exercise, is to not only get to those broader goals, but think about where we might be missing some actions that will be really important to help us get there.
I'm aware of the time, so I wonder, because we want to talk a little bit about work planning, whether a next step, Jane and Marion, is to take this really awesome brainstorming and try to crack it like 4 or 5 different options, trying to frame this up, maybe with some subcomponents. And then what we could do is then with the co-chair's help, and then come back to you all in a few weeks when we meet again and just say, here's 3 or 4 options, kind of summarize or synthesize what you said. What do you think? And then we can further hone the work that you've really nicely done here. I don't know, Marion and Jane, what do you think as next steps here?
I think if the subcommittee is willing to let it go for a little bit and then come back to it with some ideas put together, I think that makes a lot of sense. And if there's anybody specifically interested in this kind of like a smaller group of the subcommittee that wants to work on this, also over the next 2 weeks, I would encourage it to stay with the subcommittee too, with Marion and I support, as well as Pat, obviously.
Does anybody want to help frame our massive brainstorm and synthesize it down into easy to understand words?
Well, and I was going to say, it might be a good time too to, Jane, pull up the next step slide, because that might help outline like what work needs to happen in that time frame.
Right, that would be good. And I do think, just to Erica's point about volunteers, over the next few weeks, because our co-chairs are going to have some much deserved vacation, I think having someone kind of noodle with us is good, because we're not going to always get it very right. So Ben, are you raising your hand to help?
Well, I'm really interested in this and I'd like to participate, but I'm also stretched very thin right now. So if I can be kind of included, and I'll jump in to the extent that I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can send you a draft, and then you can tear it apart, for instance. You don't have to draft it. You can respond to it.
Thanks.
Others quickly. Who else? Bronwyn?
I'm sorry, I had to duck out for a phone call really quick. I just wanted to flag, I love this brainstorm as well. I just want to put in a pin for continuing to think about the transformative change that may be necessary. So for example, thinking about utility outages the way we've always thought about utility outages may not be the best way of thinking about resiliency into the future. So for example, it may not be, the length of outage in an area. It might be more about, even during an outage, did that area have backup storage that allowed them to continue operations while the grid was down? So I just wanted to flag that I think we constantly need to be thinking about framing our goals to allow for the flexibility that's needed to do the planning for the future and not the planning for the past.
And Bronwyn, I
think Bronwyn just earned herself a volunteer role in helping us craft the language.
That wasn't the intention, but sure.
I just got her in chat. She's captured.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else on that? And then we're going to move a little bit to just some next steps in work planning. Mike?
Yeah, I'd like to be involved in the goal setting at some point too, depending on when and what time and all that. So yes.
Awesome. Good. Beautiful. I like it. There we go. Good. So we used the last name. We got Ben, Bronwyn, and Burke, so we have alliteration, so it'll be easy to remember. Okay, so I think we want to shift a bit. This is terrific. So we want to shift a little bit. I'm gonna have to step off of the call in a second, but we're gonna shift a little bit of work planning. And I think as Jane shows you the next schedules, you'll see we're in good shape to head towards the meeting end of August for the Vermont Climate Council in terms of our draft kind of goals or ideas. But come September, late September, you're gonna have to start thinking about your activities and how you take all the good work you've done so far and begin to hammer your pathways, strategies, and actions into a coherent whole. So that's one of the things that we'll want to start thinking about as Jane and Marion put up the next slide. So Jane and Marion, I'm gonna hand this over to you, and really, really great work today.
So really brief, just to highlight the schedule that'll be talked about within the overall milestones for the Climate Council on Monday with the steering committee. Right now, we have the presentation of measurable goals by Rural Resilience as well as Adding Ecosystems on tap for the August Climate Council meeting in hopes of sort of formally adopting them by the Climate Council for inclusion at that high level in the climate action. We also have been hard at work developing a scope of work for application of the guiding principles and scoring rubric in concert with the Just Transition Subcommittee. I just received sort of the solicitation of names that we're going to target an invite to bid on that work with us. And my hope is to do that by the end of today, to send out the scope of work to a select number of individuals who met the criteria we discussed at the subcommittee around the kind of facilitation we'd like, and recognition that because of the intense timeline, that it'd be ideal to have someone who's familiar with the process and tools to date to help expedite that work. And so the idea being that that person or persons would be brought on board in September to step in and support the subcommittees in review and application of the scoring rubric against your actions. And so that's the hope. We're moving towards that, although it does feel aggressive still to me right now. At the council meeting in mid-September, because I'll just identify for all of you that the council will be moving to bi-weekly meetings starting in mid-September. In mid-September, cross-sector is first up for presenting their full package of actions. And then at the end of September, you all are up for doing a similar presentation of by no means final, but a full package of the actions underneath your strategies. So that level of detail that we weren't able to get to. I haven't, with Marion, a next step for us will be really to think about how we package that work for the Climate Council, how we synthesize that, recognizing that it'll be even more to take in than the pathways and strategies. And so thinking about how to communicate that, recognizing that it'll also be the time for the council to start to vet and support those ideas and raise issues. And then we'll have a number of substantive conversations between then and November, but the next sort of substantive council meeting focused on your final suite of actions, which will also be focused on how you present and communicate an assessment of those foundational criteria, which speak a lot to the equity, but also speaks to how you prioritize actions with respect to co-benefits, cost effectiveness, technical feasibility, and beyond. And meeting your measurable goal is the other one. And then also propose cost and funding considerations. So it's a super aggressive timeline between now and November. But I'd like to say that then you'll sort of be almost done with the first climate action plan, recognizing there'll be still work to do after that. But these are the milestones to be thinking about as you're planning workout, and hopeful that we'll be able to meet them. And that's all I got for this. And I have to run in 2 seconds also to pick up my kids from camp. So I'm going to leave you in very capable, able hands of Marion for questions too.
Okay. Any other questions on next steps? What'll end up probably happening is we'll keep the August 20th meeting, and I can't remember. I feel like Catherine's not here for that one. We're gonna have to work offline with Catherine to finalize the goal, because we'll have to present on the 23rd, and I'll be coming back from vacation on the 23rd. So,
Erica, perhaps, I mean, with Bronwyn, Mike, and Ben, once Catherine is back, we can maybe loop her into some of those sort of off subcommittee meetings so that she's on the same level when you leave and she comes back and all of that.
Yeah. Yep. Sounds good. Is there any other questions related to that, folks? Okay. Why don't we move into public comment? Okay, Any public comment for today? Okay, any closing comments from folks? I just have to say this was an exciting conversation today. So I love, especially in this realm, I love visioning discussions, because I really feel like we can paint a picture of what we want Vermont to look like in 25 to 30 to 40 years. And it's pretty satisfying to know that the work that we're doing is towards getting us there. So thank you, everybody, for your conversation and your discussion today, and have a wonderful weekend.